80 years ago, during the fierce fighting following D-Day, Staff Sergeant Robert "Bobby" Matthews vanished without leaving a trace during a critical reconnaissance mission behind enemy lines in Normandy. His absence plunged his family into tragedy and silent grief, while his military unit and the community back home remained confused by the mystery. Military archives suggested various theories, but no conclusion was ever reached. The case fell into official oblivion, but the family never lost hope, fighting for the truth to emerge. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here, we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. June 15, 1944. The Norman countryside still reeked of gunpowder and death, 11 days after the Allied landings had torn through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. In the war-torn village of Sainte-Mère-Église, Staff Sergeant Bobby Matthews adjusted his scope one final time before disappearing into the morning mist. At 24 years old, he was already considered one of the finest marksmen in the 82nd Airborne Division, a quiet farm boy from Nebraska whose steady hands and keen eyes had saved countless American lives during the brutal push inland from Omaha Beach. Bobby had volunteered for what military records would later classify as Operation Watchful Eye, a solo reconnaissance mission deep into German-held territory. His objective was simple yet deadly: infiltrate enemy positions south of the Douve River, gather intelligence on Wehrmacht troop movements, and eliminate high-value targets of opportunity. For a sniper of Bobby's caliber, it should have been a routine 48-hour assignment. He carried his trusted M1903 Springfield rifle, enough rations for 3 days, and a small leather notebook where he meticulously recorded wind patterns and distance calculations. Captain William Harrison, Bobby's commanding officer, would later testify that Matthews appeared confident and focused during their final briefing. He was methodical, professional, asked all the right questions about extraction points and radio protocols, Harrison recalled in a 1947 military inquiry. There was nothing unusual about his demeanor. Bobby was a soldier's soldier, reliable, competent, unshakable under pressure. The mission parameters were clear: maintain radio silence unless compromised, return to friendly lines within 48 hours, and avoid unnecessary engagement with enemy forces, unless absolutely critical to the mission's success. As dawn broke over the Norman hedgerows on June 15th, Bobby Matthews crossed into no man's land, his olive-drab uniform blending seamlessly with the countryside's morning shadows. Local French resistance fighters later reported seeing an American sniper moving through the bocage, the dense network of hedgerows that had turned Normandy into a nightmare maze for both armies. That sighting, near the village of Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte, would be the last confirmed observation of Bobby Matthews alive. The first signs of trouble emerged when Bobby failed to make his scheduled radio check-in at 1800 hours on June 16th. Military protocol allowed for communication delays due to enemy activity, so concern remained minimal. However, when Matthews failed to return to the designated extraction point by midnight on June 17th, alarm bells began ringing throughout the 82nd Airborne's command structure. A search and rescue operation was hastily organized, but German artillery bombardments and continued enemy resistance made immediate deployment impossible. When rescue teams finally penetrated the area where Bobby had last been seen, they found nothing: no body, no equipment, no signs of struggle. The dense Norman countryside seemed to have swallowed him whole. Military investigators combed through German prisoner reports, examined captured enemy documents, and interviewed every available French civilian, but Bobby Matthews had simply vanished, as if he had never existed. The official report, filed 3 weeks later, concluded with frustrating bureaucratic language: Staff Sergeant Robert Matthews, serial number 372418859, status changed from active duty to missing in action. Circumstances of disappearance remain unknown. Investigation ongoing pending additional intelligence. Back home in Grand Island, Nebraska, Margaret Matthews received the dreaded telegram on July 4th, 1944, a cruel irony that would haunt her for decades. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your husband, Staff Sergeant Robert Matthews, has been reported missing in action in France since 15 June. At 19 years old, with a 6-month-old daughter named Sarah, Margaret's world collapsed. The young bride who had married her high school sweetheart just days before his deployment now faced an uncertain future filled with questions that had no answers. The War Department's casualty notification system, overwhelmed by massive losses throughout the European theater, could offer little comfort beyond standard procedures and empty promises of continued investigation. Margaret would spend the next 8 decades wondering whether Bobby was dead, captured, wounded, or somehow lost in the chaos of war. That uncertainty would define not only her life, but the life of their daughter Sarah, who would grow up knowing her father only through faded photographs and her mother's increasingly fragmented memories. Robert James Matthews was born on March 12, 1920, in the heart of Nebraska's agricultural belt, where endless fields of corn and wheat stretched toward horizons that seemed to touch eternity itself. His father, Henry Matthews, worked the family farm with calloused hands and unwavering determination, while his mother, Dorothy, managed their modest household with the quiet strength that defined Depression-era American women. Bobby was the middle child of 3, sandwiched between his older brother Frank and younger sister Helen, in a family where hard work, faith, and loyalty weren't just values, they were survival tools. From his earliest childhood, Bobby displayed an almost supernatural ability with firearms. Henry had taught all his children to hunt, both for food and to protect their crops from persistent wildlife, but Bobby possessed a natural talent that left even seasoned hunters shaking their heads in amazement. At age 12, he could drop a running rabbit at 200 yards with his father's old Winchester. By 14, he was regularly outscoring adults at local shooting competitions, earning nicknames like Deadeye Bobby and the Farm Boy Sniper. His precision with a rifle wasn't just impressive, it was almost unsettling in its consistency and accuracy. Grand Island High School's rifle team became Bobby's first taste of organized competition and military-style discipline. Coach William Mitchell, a Great War veteran who still walked with a slight limp from Belleau Wood, recognized something special in the quiet farm boy. Bobby didn't just shoot, Mitchell would later recall in a 1960 interview with the Grand Island Independent. He understood ballistics instinctively. Wind drift, bullet drop, atmospheric pressure, things that took other kids months to learn, Bobby grasped in minutes. It was like he could see the bullet's path before he pulled the trigger. Margaret Sullivan first noticed Bobby during their junior year, not because of his shooting prowess, but because of his gentle demeanor in their shared English literature class. While other boys showed off with crude jokes and aggressive posturing, Bobby possessed a quiet confidence that drew her attention. He would help struggling classmates with their homework, volunteer for community service projects, and treat everyone, from the popular students to the social outcasts, with the same respectful courtesy. Their romance began with shared walks through Grand Island's tree-lined streets and evolved into a deep, abiding love that would endure separation, uncertainty, and decades of heartbreak. When Pearl Harbor thrust America into World War II, Bobby was completing his senior year and planning to propose to Margaret after graduation. Like millions of young American men, the attack transformed his life's trajectory overnight. He could have easily secured a deferment to help manage his family's farm. Agriculture was considered essential to the war effort, but Bobby felt a moral obligation to serve. "Hitler's killing innocent people," he told his father, during a conversation that Henry would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. "I've got skills that could help end this war faster and bring our boys home sooner." Bobby enlisted in the army on January 15, 1943, 3 days after his proposal to Margaret was accepted, with tears of joy and terror. Their wedding, held on February 14th in the simple Methodist church where both families had worshipped for generations, was a bittersweet affair. The entire community gathered to celebrate the young couple's union while simultaneously mourning Bobby's imminent departure for military service. Margaret wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit her petite frame, while Bobby stood proud in his new army uniform, the fabric still stiff from the factory. Basic training at Camp Roberts, California, revealed Bobby's extraordinary potential to military instructors who had seen thousands of recruits pass through their programs. Drill Sergeant Murphy, a grizzled veteran of the First World War, wrote in Bobby's evaluation, "Private Matthews possesses exceptional marksmanship abilities and demonstrates natural leadership qualities. Recommend immediate consideration for advanced sniper training. This soldier could be a significant asset to specialized units." Bobby's scores on the rifle range weren't just impressive, they were record-breaking, consistently achieving perfect marks at distances that challenged even experienced marksmen. The transition from Nebraska farm boy to elite military sniper, occurred at Camp Pendleton's specialized training facility, where Bobby learned the deadly arts of concealment, stalking, observation, and precision elimination. He mastered camouflage techniques that could make him invisible in any terrain, studied enemy uniforms and equipment until he could identify ranks and units at impossible distances, and developed the psychological discipline necessary to remain motionless for hours while waiting for the perfect shot. His instructors noted his unusual ability to remain calm under extreme pressure and his almost supernatural patience during long-range engagements. Letters between Bobby and Margaret during his training period reveal a young man grappling with the moral complexities of his new role while maintaining his fundamental decency and humanity. "I know what they're training me to do," he wrote in March 1943, "but I keep reminding myself that every shot I take could save American lives and bring this war to an end sooner. I'm not becoming a killer, Margaret. I'm becoming a protector." These letters, preserved by Margaret for 8 decades, would become crucial evidence in understanding Bobby's state of mind before his deployment to the European theater. The first letter arrived on September 3, 1943, postmarked from somewhere in England, though military censors had carefully blacked out any specific location details that might compromise operational security. Margaret Matthews, now visibly pregnant and living with Bobby's parents on the family farm, tore open the envelope with trembling fingers, desperate for any connection to her husband who had disappeared into the vast machinery of World War II. "My dearest Margaret," Bobby had written in his careful, precise handwriting, "I can't tell you where I am, but I can tell you I'm safe and thinking about you and our baby every moment of every day." Bobby's letters from England painted a picture of intensive training, camaraderie among soldiers, and growing anticipation for the invasion everyone knew was coming, but no one could discuss openly. He described the English countryside in terms that reminded him of home: rolling hills, farmland, and hard-working people who welcomed American soldiers with genuine warmth despite years of war-induced hardship. "The farmers here remind me of Dad," he wrote in October 1943. "They work from dawn to dusk, never complaining, just doing what needs to be done to keep their families fed and their country free." What Bobby couldn't write about, and what Margaret would only learn decades later through declassified military records, was the specialized training he was receiving as part of an elite sniper unit preparing for the most ambitious amphibious invasion in human history. Days were spent perfecting long-range shooting techniques, studying German defensive positions through captured photographs, and rehearsing beach assault scenarios on the English coast. Nights were filled with intelligence briefings about enemy troop dispositions, equipment identification, and the tactical challenges they would face when the invasion finally commenced. The last letter Margaret received before D-Day arrived on May 15, 1944, though it wouldn't reach the Nebraska farm until early June. Bobby's tone had shifted subtly, still loving and optimistic, but carrying an undercurrent of solemnity that suggested he understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. "I want you to know," he wrote, "that whatever happens in the coming days, my love for you will transcend any battlefield, any ocean, any distance that war might create between us. If something happens to me, promise me you'll tell our child about the farm, about Nebraska sunsets, about the life we plan to build together. You to know," he wrote, "that whatever happens in the coming days, my love for you will transcend any battlefield, any ocean, any distance that war might create between us. If something happens to me, promise me you'll tell our child about the farm, about Nebraska sunsets, about the life we plan to build together." Margaret would read that letter hundreds of times over the following decades, searching for hidden meanings in every word, wondering if Bobby had somehow sensed his fate. The pregnancy had been difficult, morning sickness that lasted well into her second trimester, combined with the constant anxiety of not knowing where her husband was or what dangers he was facing. Dorothy Matthews had become her anchor during those dark months, sharing stories about Henry's service in the First World War and offering the kind of maternal comfort that only another military wife could provide. Sarah Elizabeth Matthews was born on December 8, 1943, Pearl Harbor Day plus 2 years, a timing that would forever link her birth to the war that had already stolen so much from their family. Bobby never knew his daughter had arrived safely until a Red Cross telegram reached him in England 3 weeks later. His response, sent through military channels, was brief but emotional. Tell Margaret she has given me the greatest gift imaginable. Tell Sarah that Daddy is fighting to come home to her. The correspondence gap between late May and mid-June 1944 should have prepared Margaret for bad news, but military wives had learned to endure communication blackouts during major operations. The D-Day invasion, though not officially announced until after it had begun, created a total media silence that left families across America in agonizing suspense. Margaret followed news reports obsessively, trying to read between the lines of censored dispatches from Normandy, searching for any clue about Bobby's unit or his safety. When the telegram finally arrived on July 4th, Margaret was in the kitchen preparing a holiday meal, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for 6-month-old Sarah. The Western Union delivery boy, Tommy Peterson from town, knocked hesitantly on the farmhouse door, his young face reflecting the gravity of his message. Margaret's knees buckled as she read the official language. Missing in action. Not killed, not wounded. Missing. The word would haunt her for the next 80 years. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from, and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The immediate aftermath of Bobby's disappearance created a bureaucratic nightmare for his family. Margaret's dependent benefits were suspended pending clarification of Bobby's status. The military couldn't pay survivor benefits for someone who might still be alive, but they also couldn't provide full dependent support for someone who might be dead. The financial strain forced Margaret to move permanently to the Matthews family farm, where Henry and Dorothy welcomed her and Sarah with open arms, but struggled to hide their own grief and uncertainty. Letters from Bobby's fellow soldiers began arriving in late July, each offering condolences, shared memories, and their own theories about what might have happened during that final mission. Corporal James Mitchell wrote, "Bobby was the steadiest guy in our unit. He never took unnecessary risks, always followed protocol to the letter. Whatever happened out there, it wasn't because he made a mistake or got careless." These testimonials, while comforting, only deepened the mystery surrounding Bobby's fate. The War Department's official investigation, conducted throughout the summer of 1944, revealed frustratingly little new information. German prisoner interrogations yielded no mentions of capturing an American sniper. French resistance networks, questioned extensively by Allied intelligence officers, reported no sightings of Bobby after that initial observation near Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte. Enemy documents captured during the continuing Normandy campaign contained no references to eliminating American snipers in the relevant time frame and location. Margaret's letters to military officials, congressmen, and anyone else who might have influence became increasingly desperate as months turned to years. She wrote to the Secretary of War, the American Red Cross, and veterans organizations, pleading for continued investigation into Bobby's disappearance. Most responses were form letters expressing sympathy and promising that the search would continue, but Margaret sensed that Bobby's case was gradually being filed away and forgotten amid the chaos of a global war that was consuming resources and attention. By 1945, as victory in Europe became imminent, Margaret had developed a daily routine that would define the rest of her life. Each morning, she would check the mail with the irrational hope that a letter from Bobby might somehow appear. Each evening, she would write in a journal addressed to her missing husband, documenting Sarah's development, farm life, family news, and her own emotional journey through grief, hope, anger, and acceptance. "Sarah took her first steps today," she wrote on August 15, 1945, "the day Japan surrendered. She walked straight to your photograph on the mantel, Bobby. It's like she knows you're supposed to be here." The official end of World War II in September 1945 brought celebration to most American families, but for Margaret Matthews and thousands of others with missing loved ones, victory felt hollow and incomplete. While ticker tape parades filled city streets and returning veterans were welcomed home as heroes, Margaret remained trapped in an emotional limbo that would define the next 79 years of her life. The American Graves Registration Service, tasked with recovering and identifying fallen soldiers throughout Europe, launched extensive search operations in Normandy and surrounding areas, but Bobby Matthews remained among the permanently missing. Margaret's determination to find answers intensified rather than diminished as the years passed. She corresponded with French government officials, wrote to veterans organizations, and eventually established contact with Norman families who had witnessed the fighting around Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte. Through broken English and patient translation, local residents shared fragmented memories of the American sniper who had passed through their village in June 1944, but none could provide definitive information about his ultimate fate. In 1947, Margaret made the extraordinary decision to travel to France herself, using money she had saved from selling her portion of the family farm. The journey, undertaken with 2-year-old Sarah in tow, shocked both families and drew criticism from neighbors who thought a young widow should focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on the past. Margaret ignored the whispers and boarded a ship in New York Harbor, determined to walk the same Norman fields where Bobby had vanished and interview anyone who might have seen or heard something during those chaotic days following D-Day. The Normandy countryside in 1947 still bore deep scars from the invasion and subsequent battles. Destroyed villages were slowly being rebuilt, farmers were clearing unexploded ordnance from their fields, and local families were gradually returning to some semblance of normal life. Margaret, speaking through interpreters and relying on the kindness of war-weary French civilians, retraced Bobby's last known movements with the thoroughness of a professional investigator. She photographed potential hiding places, documented distances and sightlines, and compiled a detailed map of the area where Bobby had disappeared. The most promising lead came from an elderly farmer named Henri Dubois, whose property bordered the hedgerow where Bobby had last been sighted. Through halting English and gestures, Dubois explained that he had heard rifle shots on the morning of June 16th, followed by what sounded like a brief firefight involving automatic weapons. When he investigated hours later, he found disturbed earth and broken vegetation, but no bodies or equipment. German patrols had swept the area repeatedly over the following days, but Dubois never learned what they might have found or removed. Margaret's most haunting discovery came when she located the exact spot where resistance fighters had reported seeing Bobby. Standing in the shadow of an ancient Norman hedgerow, holding Sarah's tiny hand while imagining her husband's final moments, Margaret experienced a grief so profound that local villagers still remembered her tears decades later. She spent 3 hours in that location, searching through tall grass and examining every tree, stone and depression that might hold clues about Bobby's fate. The only items she discovered were rusty fragments of military equipment that could have belonged to any of the thousands of soldiers who had fought and died in those fields. The trip to France yielded no concrete answers, but it strengthened Margaret's resolve to never stop searching. She returned to Nebraska with detailed notes, photographs, and contacts among Norman residents who promised to notify her if any evidence of Bobby ever surfaced. More importantly, she returned with the absolute conviction that her husband was dead, killed in action during that June 1944 mission, even though his body had never been recovered. The certainty brought a strange comfort, allowing her to begin the grieving process that had been suspended for 3 years. Margaret's campaign for official recognition of Bobby's death began in earnest upon her return from France. She petitioned the War Department to change Bobby's status from missing in action to killed in action, citing her investigation in Normandy and the obvious impossibility of his survival after 3 years without contact. The bureaucratic battle consumed months of correspondence, requiring sworn affidavits from French witnesses, detailed reports from Margaret's investigation, and testimonials from Bobby's former commanding officers who had long since returned to civilian life. The status change, finally approved in December 1948, allowed Margaret to receive widow's benefits and gave her legal grounds to hold a memorial service for Bobby at their home church in Grand Island. The ceremony, attended by hundreds of community members and former soldiers who had served with Bobby, provided the closure that military protocol had previously denied. Bobby's name was added to the local war memorial, and Margaret finally felt permission to begin building a new life for herself and Sarah while maintaining her husband's memory. Sarah's childhood was shaped by the absence of her father and the presence of his legend. Margaret shared every story, every photograph, and every detail about Bobby that she could remember, determined that their daughter would know her father as more than just a name on a memorial plaque. The little girl grew up understanding that her daddy had been a hero who died fighting to protect America and free Europe from tyranny. She learned to shoot with Bobby's old hunting rifle, studied maps of Normandy until she could locate Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte without hesitation, and promised her mother that someday They would return to France together to visit the place where Bobby had made his final sacrifice. The 1950s brought gradual acceptance of their loss, but Margaret never stopped monitoring any news related to missing American servicemen or World War II discoveries in France. She corresponded with other military families who had lost loved ones in Normandy, sharing information and supporting each other through the unique grief of those whose heroes had simply vanished without trace. These relationships, maintained through decades of letters and occasional reunions, created an informal network of families united by loss and sustained by hope that somewhere, somehow, their missing soldiers might finally be found and brought home. Sarah Matthews grew up in the long shadow of a father she never knew, surrounded by photographs, medals, and stories that made Bobby seem more mythical than real. The Nebraska farmhouse where she spent her childhood was essentially a shrine to her missing father. His Purple Heart and Bronze Star displayed prominently in the living room, his favorite chair left empty at the dinner table, and his rifle cleaned and maintained, as if he might return at any moment to take it hunting. Margaret's devotion to preserving Bobby's memory created a strange duality in Sarah's childhood. She felt both incredibly connected to her father's legacy and painfully aware of the enormous void his absence created. School presented unique challenges for Sarah, who struggled to explain her father's status to classmates whose fathers had either returned from the war or whose deaths could be clearly documented and honored. While other children spoke matter-of-factly about their father's war experiences or visited clearly marked graves on Memorial Day, Sarah could only offer vague explanations about missions gone wrong and bodies never found. The ambiguity of Bobby's fate made her feel different, isolated, and sometimes ashamed that her family's sacrifice seemed somehow less complete or honorable than others. Margaret's annual trips to the Grand Island Cemetery on Memorial Day became elaborate rituals that both comforted and tormented Sarah throughout her youth. Without a grave to visit, they would stand before the community war memorial and read Bobby's name aloud, leave flowers at the base of the monument, and recite the details of his service record as if repetition might somehow bring closure. Other families gathered around specific headstones with clear dates and definitive endings, while Sarah and Margaret stood before a piece of carved stone that marked absence rather than presence. As Sarah entered adolescence, her relationship with Bobby's memory became increasingly complicated. She resented the impossibility of competing with a perfect father who existed only in stories and photographs, who could never disappoint her with human flaws or ordinary parental mistakes. Every report card, every school performance, and every teenage rebellion was measured against the standard of a war hero who had died before displaying any weaknesses or imperfections. Margaret's tendency to invoke Bobby's memory during disciplinary moments, "Your father would be so proud," or "Bobby always believed in doing the right thing," made Sarah feel like she was being raised by a ghost rather than a living parent. The 1960s brought renewed interest in World War II history and a new generation of researchers investigating unsolved cases from the conflict. Margaret eagerly corresponded with military historians, amateur genealogists, and French archivists who periodically launched new searches for missing American servicemen. Each inquiry raised hopes that would inevitably be dashed when investigations yielded no new information about Bobby's fate. Sarah watched her mother cycle through optimism and disappointment with increasing frustration, wondering why they couldn't simply accept Bobby's death and move forward with their lives. College provided Sarah's first real escape from the suffocating atmosphere of perpetual mourning that had defined her childhood. At the University of Nebraska, she initially majored in history, drawn by a subconscious desire to understand the war that had shaped her family's destiny. However, studying World War II in academic detail made Bobby's disappearance feel even more inexplicable and troubling. How could someone simply vanish without a trace in the most documented conflict in human history? The question haunted her studies and eventually drove her to change majors to education, seeking a career focused on the future rather than the past. Sarah's first serious relationship, with a classmate named Michael Thompson, whose father had served in the Pacific Theater, forced her to confront how Bobby's absence had affected her ability to trust men or believe in permanent relationships. Michael's complaints that Sarah seemed emotionally unavailable and unable to commit to future plans reflected deeper psychological damage caused by growing up with a father who had promised to return but never did. The relationship ended during their senior year, with Michael telling Sarah that she was married to a ghost and couldn't love anyone who actually existed in the present. Marriage to David Coleman, a kind and patient elementary school teacher she met during her first year of teaching, provided Sarah with the stable family life she had never experienced as a child. David understood Sarah's complicated relationship with her father's memory and never competed with Bobby's legend or tried to diminish his importance in the family narrative. Their wedding in 1969 was deliberately small and private, avoiding the kind of elaborate celebration that might emphasize Bobby's absence or create painful comparisons with Margaret and Bobby's own wartime wedding. The birth of Sarah's children, Robert James Coleman in 1971 and Margaret Dorothy Coleman in 1973, created a new dynamic in the family's relationship with Bobby's memory. Sarah was determined that her children would know their grandfather's story without being burdened by the unresolved grief that had defined her own childhood. She shared age-appropriate stories about Bobby's courage and sacrifice, while emphasizing that death was a natural part of war and that unanswered questions didn't diminish the value of his service or the love he had felt for his family. Margaret's role as grandmother allowed her to channel her devotion to Bobby's memory in healthier directions, sharing stories that focused on his humor, kindness, and dreams for the future, rather than obsessing over the circumstances of his disappearance. Young Robert and Margaret Coleman grew up understanding that their grandfather had been a hero, but they also learned about his love of farming, his skill at baseball, and his plans to build a larger farmhouse where he could raise a big family. These human details, which Margaret had rarely shared with Sarah, helped Bobby's legacy feel more authentic and less mythological. The approach of Bobby's 60th birthday in 1980 triggered a new wave of investigation and publicity around his case. Margaret, now 55 years old and still hoping for answers, contacted a television news program that specialized in unsolved mysteries. The segment, aired on the anniversary of D-Day, featured interviews with Margaret and Sarah, photographs of Bobby's military service, and an appeal for any information about American servicemen who had gone missing in Normandy during June 1944. The broadcast generated hundreds of letters from viewers, but none provided credible leads about Bobby's fate. The 1980s marked a turning point in Margaret's relationship with Bobby's disappearance, as advancing age and declining health forced her to confront the reality that she might never learn the truth about her husband's fate. At 55, Margaret had spent more of her life as Bobby's widow than as his wife, yet her devotion to his memory remained as strong as ever. The farmhouse had become a museum to their brief marriage and his military service, with every room containing some memento of the man who had vanished in the Norman countryside 4 decades earlier. Sarah, now established in her own career and family life, began encouraging her mother to consider dating, or at least developing social relationships, beyond their insular circle of military families and war widows. Margaret's response was always the same. Bobby was her husband, and until she received definitive proof of his death, she would continue to honor their marriage vows. This steadfast loyalty, admirable in its devotion, had effectively isolated Margaret from the normal social connections that might have provided comfort and companionship during her later years. The arrival of personal computers and early internet technology in the late 1980s opened new possibilities for research into missing World War II servicemen. Margaret, despite her advanced age, learned to use basic computer programs and began corresponding with researchers around the world who were investigating similar cases. Online forums dedicated to missing military personnel connected her with families in England, France, Australia, and across the United States who shared her experience of unresolved loss and perpetual uncertainty. Through these connections, Margaret learned about advances in forensic archaeology and the increasing sophistication of techniques used to locate and identify remains from World War II battlefields. Teams of researchers were systematically examining crash sites, battlefield locations, and unmarked burial sites throughout Europe, using metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and DNA analysis to solve cases that had remained mysteries for decades. Each successful identification of previously unknown remains gave Margaret hope that Bobby's case might eventually be resolved through similar methods. If this case has already captured your attention, leave a like. It helps Bobby Matthews' story reach more people. The 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994 brought renewed media attention to unresolved cases from the Normandy invasion, including Bobby's disappearance. Margaret, now 69 years old and using a wheelchair due to arthritis, traveled to France with Sarah and her grandchildren for commemoration ceremonies that honored both the known dead and the missing who had never been found. The trip was emotionally exhausting, but provided Margaret with a sense of pilgrimage and closure that she had sought for 5 decades. Standing in the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, surrounded by thousands of white crosses marking identified graves, Margaret was overwhelmed by the stark reality of Bobby's absence. While other families could visit specific grave sites and leave flowers at clearly marked memorials, Margaret could only stand before the wall of the missing, where Bobby's name was carved among hundreds of others whose remains had never been recovered. The experience was both devastating and oddly comforting. Bobby was honored alongside his fallen comrades, even if his physical remains remained lost somewhere in the Norman countryside. During that 1994 trip, Sarah made a decision that would define the next phase of their family's relationship with Bobby's memory. She began seriously researching genealogy and family history, documenting not only Bobby's military service, but also his childhood, education, and the broader Matthews family story that had been overshadowed by his disappearance. This project, initially intended as a gift for Margaret's 70th birthday, evolved into a comprehensive family archive that preserved Bobby's legacy in ways that went beyond his military service and mysterious fate. The emergence of the Internet as a research tool in the late 1990s revolutionized Margaret's ability to investigate Bobby's case and connect with others interested in World War II history. She learned to search military databases, access digitized records, and communicate with researchers who were using new technology to solve old mysteries. Her correspondence expanded to include French local historians, metal detector hobbyists, and amateur archaeologists, who periodically searched Norman battlefields for artifacts and remains from the 1944 fighting. Margaret's 75th birthday in 1999 was marked by a significant milestone, the completion of Sarah's comprehensive family history project, which filled 3 large binders with photographs, documents, letters, and research materials related to Bobby's life and disappearance. The project included maps of his last known location, copies of all military records, testimonials from surviving veterans who had served with him, and detailed timelines of the search efforts that had consumed Margaret's adult life. More importantly, it established Bobby's legacy as more than just a missing soldier. He was documented as a son, husband, father, and community member whose life had meaning beyond the circumstances of his death. The new millennium brought both hope and heartbreak, as advancing technology made it possible to solve increasingly old cases while simultaneously highlighting how many World War II mysteries might never be resolved. Margaret, now 75 and in declining health, began experiencing memory problems that made it difficult for her to maintain the detailed correspondence and research activities that had defined her previous decades. Sarah gradually assumed responsibility for monitoring developments in Bobby's case, while ensuring that her mother's later years weren't consumed by the futile pursuit of answers that might never come. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, created an unexpected connection between Bobby's World War II service and contemporary military families facing similar uncertainties about missing loved ones. Margaret, despite her advanced age and failing health, began corresponding with families of servicemen who had disappeared during operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Her letters, written with Sarah's assistance, offered comfort and understanding from someone who had spent nearly 6 decades living with the uncertainty of not knowing a loved one's fate. Margaret's death on December 7, 2008, Pearl Harbor Day, 67 years after the attack that had launched Bobby into military service, marked the end of an era in the family's relationship with his disappearance. She died without ever learning the truth about Bobby's fate, but surrounded by family members who understood that her devotion to his memory had been both her greatest source of strength and her deepest burden. Sarah inherited not only Margaret's possessions, but also the responsibility of maintaining Bobby's legacy and continuing the search that had defined 3 generations of their family. Sarah Coleman assumed the role of family historian and primary researcher into her father's disappearance with a mixture of determination and dread. At 65, she possessed her mother's tenacity, but approached Bobby's case with a more pragmatic understanding of the limitations they faced after more than 6 decades of fruitless investigation. Unlike Margaret, who had maintained an almost religious faith that the truth would eventually emerge, Sarah understood that Bobby's fate might remain forever unknown, and she was determined to find peace with that possibility while still honoring his memory appropriately. The digital revolution of the 2000s and 2010s provided Sarah with research tools that Margaret could never have imagined. Online databases containing millions of military records, digitized newspapers from the 1940s, and sophisticated genealogy websites allowed Sarah to piece together details about Bobby's military service and last known location with unprecedented precision. She located previously unknown photographs of Bobby's unit, identified specific locations where he had trained in England, and even found records of equipment he had been issued before his final mission. Sarah's most significant breakthrough came through contact with Dr. Philippe Moreau, a French military historian who specialized in researching battlefield archaeology throughout Normandy. Dr. Moreau's team had been systematically investigating sites where Allied servicemen had gone missing, using ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and careful excavation techniques to locate remains and personal effects that might have been overlooked during wartime recovery operations. When Sarah contacted him about Bobby's case in 2009, Dr. Moreau agreed to add the Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte area to his team's research schedule. The initial investigation, conducted in the summer of 2010, covered a 3-square-kilometer area around Bobby's last known location. Dr. Moreau's team spent 2 weeks methodically scanning the hedgerows, farm fields, and wooded areas where Bobby might have taken cover or been captured. They discovered numerous artifacts from the 1944 fighting: rifle parts, helmet fragments, uniform buttons, and personal items that had belonged to both American and German soldiers, but nothing that could be definitively connected to Bobby Matthews or his final mission. Sarah's grandchildren, Robert James Coleman Jr. and Margaret Maggie Coleman, represented the 4th generation of the family to be affected by Bobby's disappearance, though their relationship with his legacy was notably different from the grief-stricken devotion that had defined their grandmother Margaret's life. As college students in the 2010s, they approached their great-grandfather's story with intellectual curiosity rather than emotional desperation, using modern research methods and social media to investigate his case while maintaining healthy psychological distance from the unresolved trauma. Robert Jr., studying computer science at the University of Nebraska, created a comprehensive website dedicated to Bobby's case, complete with digitized documents, interactive maps of the search area, and forums where visitors could share information about similar cases. The website attracted attention from military historians, veteran families, and amateur researchers around the world, generating leads and theories that Sarah dutifully investigated despite their usually speculative nature. More importantly, the website preserved Bobby's story for future generations and ensured that his sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten, even if the circumstances of his death remained mysterious. Maggie, pursuing a degree in psychology, wrote her senior thesis on the intergenerational effects of ambiguous loss, the specific type of grief experienced by families of missing servicemen who never received definitive answers about their loved ones' fates. Her research, which focused partly on her own family's experience, helped her understand the psychological patterns that had shaped 3 generations of Matthews women and provided insights into healthier ways of preserving Bobby's memory without being consumed by the uncertainty surrounding his disappearance. The 70th anniversary of D-Day in 2014 brought renewed international attention to unresolved cases from the Normandy invasion, including several high-profile discoveries of previously unknown crash sites and burial locations. Sarah, now 70 herself, traveled to France with her children and grandchildren for commemoration ceremonies that honored both the identified dead and those who remained missing. The trip served as both pilgrimage and closure, a final family journey to the place where Bobby had vanished, and an acknowledgement that their active search might need to end with their generation. During the 2014 trip, Sarah met with representatives from the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, the modern successor to the military organizations that had investigated Bobby's disappearance during and after the war. Agency officials explained that while Bobby's case remained technically open, The likelihood of discovering new evidence after 70 years was extremely small, unless construction projects or agricultural activities accidentally uncovered previously hidden remains. They assured Sarah that any discoveries in the Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte area would be thoroughly investigated and cross-referenced with Bobby's case file. Sarah's decision to gradually reduce active investigation into Bobby's disappearance reflected both practical limitations and psychological wisdom. At 70, she lacked the physical energy and financial resources to continue the extensive travel and research that had consumed Margaret's later decades. More importantly, she recognized that her own children and grandchildren deserved to inherit Bobby's legacy as a source of family pride rather than unresolved trauma. The shift from active investigation to passive commemoration allowed the family to honor Bobby's sacrifice while building healthy relationships with his memory. The establishment of the Robert Matthews Memorial Scholarship at Grand Island High School in 2015 marked Sarah's effort to transform her father's legacy into something positive and forward-looking. The scholarship, funded by donations from veteran organizations and community members who remembered Bobby's family, provided financial assistance to students interested in military service or careers in public service. The annual scholarship ceremony became the family's primary way of honoring Bobby's memory, focusing on his values and aspirations rather than the mystery surrounding his death. Sarah's memoir, Waiting for Bobby, A Daughter's Search for Her Missing Father, published in 2018, provided a comprehensive account of the family's 7-decade quest for answers about Bobby's fate. The book, written partly as therapy and partly as historical record, documented the emotional toll of ambiguous loss while celebrating Bobby's life and service. Reviews praised Sarah's honest portrayal of the psychological complexities involved in grieving someone whose death couldn't be confirmed, and the book became a resource for other military families facing similar circumstances. The memoir's publication brought Sarah into contact with researchers and military families around the world who were dealing with similar cases of missing servicemen from various conflicts. These connections provided both comfort and perspective, helping Sarah understand that the Matthews family's experience, while deeply personal, was part of a much larger phenomenon affecting thousands of families whose loved ones had disappeared during wartime. The shared experience of ambiguous loss created bonds that transcended national boundaries and historical periods. The phone call that would finally answer 7 decades of questions came on a crisp October morning in 2024, just 3 days before what would have been Bobby Matthews' 104th birthday. Sarah Coleman, now 80 and living in the same Grand Island house where she had grown up surrounded by her father's memory, initially thought the heavily accented English voice belonged to another amateur researcher or genealogy enthusiast offering theories about Bobby's disappearance that would ultimately lead nowhere. Dr. Antoine Rousseau, a battlefield archaeologist from the University of Caen, was calling with news that would transform the Matthews family's relationship with their decades-old mystery. During a routine archaeological survey of a planned housing development near Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte, his team had discovered what appeared to be a previously unknown German bunker complex that had been sealed and forgotten since the summer of 1944. Initial exploration of the partially collapsed structure had revealed American military equipment, personal items, and most significantly, a helmet bearing the distinctive markings of the 82nd Airborne Division. Sarah's hands trembled as Dr. Rousseau described the discovery in careful professional language, designed to manage expectations while conveying the significance of the find. The helmet, found in a chamber that had been blocked by debris for 8 decades, bore traces of blood and showed damage consistent with small arms fire. More importantly, the serial numbers and unit markings matched records for equipment that had been issued to Staff Sergeant Robert Matthews before his final mission in June 1944. The bunker complex, according to Dr. Rousseau's preliminary assessment, appeared to have been a German observation post and communications center that had been abandoned hastily during the Allied advance following D-Day. The presence of American equipment suggested that the position had either been attacked by Allied forces or infiltrated by reconnaissance personnel before being sealed by explosions that had brought down portions of the concrete structure. The archaeological evidence painted a picture of fierce, close-quarters fighting that had left the bunker uninhabitable and eventually forgotten. Sarah's first call was to her son Robert, whose website about Bobby's case had attracted Dr. Rousseau's attention and provided the contact information that made the notification possible. Robert immediately began coordinating with French authorities, American military representatives, and family members to ensure that the discovery would be thoroughly investigated and that any human remains would be treated with appropriate dignity and respect. The family's decades of maintaining detailed records and contact lists proved invaluable in managing the complex international logistics involved in the investigation. The formal archaeological excavation, conducted over 2 weeks in November 2024, involved teams from the University of Caen, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, and French Ministry of Culture representatives. Sarah, despite her advanced age, traveled to France with her entire extended family to witness the careful exploration of the bunker that might finally provide answers about Bobby's fate. The excavation was painstakingly slow, with every layer of debris photographed and catalogued before removal. The discovery that would provide definitive answers came on November 12, 2024, Veterans Day in the United States. Deep within the bunker's main chamber, partially buried beneath concrete rubble and decades of accumulated sediment, excavators uncovered human remains that had been protected from the elements by the sealed environment. The skeletal remains were found alongside personal items that left no doubt about the individual's identity. Dog tags bearing the name Matthews, Robert J., and serial number 3724189, a wedding ring inscribed with M&B Forever, and a leather-bound notebook containing sketches and calculations in Bobby's distinctive handwriting. The notebook, miraculously preserved by the bunker's dry conditions, provided the first direct evidence of Bobby's activities during his final mission. His careful notations documented German troop positions, equipment observations, and tactical assessments that revealed the intelligence value of his reconnaissance work. The final entries, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, described his discovery of the bunker complex and his decision to infiltrate the position despite being outnumbered and cut off from friendly forces. Bobby's last written words, discovered on the notebook's final page, were addressed to Margaret and Sarah. "If anyone finds this, tell my wife I kept my promise to come home, even if it took 80 years. Tell my daughter her daddy loved her more than all the stars in Nebraska's sky. The mission was worth it. The intelligence I gathered will save American lives. I die proud to be a soldier and blessed to be their husband and father." The forensic analysis, conducted by specialists from both French and American institutions, confirmed that Bobby had died from gunshot wounds consistent with combat injuries. The evidence suggested that he had successfully infiltrated the German bunker, gathered crucial intelligence, and engaged in a firefight with enemy personnel before succumbing to his wounds. The bunker had apparently been sealed by explosions, possibly set by Bobby himself to prevent enemy use of the position, that had entombed him alongside several German soldiers, whose remains were also discovered during the excavation. Dr. Rousseau's final report, delivered to the family in December 2024, provided a comprehensive reconstruction of Bobby's final hours based on archaeological evidence, historical records, and the contents of his notebook. The report concluded that Bobby had exceeded the scope of his original mission by infiltrating and neutralizing a crucial German observation post, gathering intelligence that had contributed to subsequent Allied operations in the area. His actions, while resulting in his death, had likely saved numerous American lives by eliminating an enemy position that could have directed artillery fire against advancing Allied forces. The positive identification of Bobby's remains and the recovery of his personal effects marked the end of the longest-running missing person case in the Matthews family history. Sarah's emotions were complex. Grief for the confirmation of her father's death, mixed with profound relief at finally knowing the truth and immense pride in learning the heroic circumstances of his final mission. After 80 years of uncertainty, the family finally had definitive answers about Bobby's fate and could begin the process of bringing him home. The process of repatriating Bobby Matthews' remains and personal effects required months of coordination between French authorities, the American military, and State Department officials, but Sarah Coleman was determined that her father would finally receive the homecoming that had been delayed for 8 decades. The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, working with their French counterparts, ensured that every aspect of the repatriation would honor Bobby's service while respecting the family's wishes for his final burial arrangements. The formal ceremony transferring Bobby's remains from French to American custody took place at the American Cemetery in Colleville-sur-Mer on March 15, 2025, exactly 81 years after his original deployment to England. Sarah, now 81 herself, and using a wheelchair due to declining mobility, was joined by more than 40 family members representing 4 generations of descendants who had been shaped by Bobby's absence. The ceremony included military honors, speeches by French and American officials, and the presentation of Bobby's recovered personal effects to Sarah in a flag-draped case. The flight carrying Bobby's remains to the United States was met at Omaha's Eppley Airfield by an honor guard from the Nebraska National Guard, representatives from veterans organizations, and hundreds of community members who had followed the family's story through decades of searching. The homecoming reception, organized by the Grand Island community, provided an opportunity for Sarah to share the story of Bobby's discovery and to thank the countless individuals who had supported the family's quest for answers over the past 80 years. Bobby's funeral, held on March 22, 2025 at the same Methodist church where he and Margaret had been married in 1943, was both celebration and culmination. The service honored not only Bobby's military sacrifice, but also the devotion of Margaret, who had spent 64 years maintaining his memory, and Sarah, who had continued the search for another 16 years after her mother's death. The church was filled with family members, community leaders, military representatives, and researchers from around the world who had become invested in Bobby's story through their own investigations into missing World War II servicemen. The discovery of Bobby's notebook provided insights into his character and motivations that transformed him from a mythical figure into a complete human being for his descendants who had never known him personally. His detailed observations about German positions revealed his professional competence and dedication to duty, while personal notes about missing home and worrying about Margaret's pregnancy showed his humanity and vulnerability. Most importantly, his final message to his family demonstrated that even in his last moments his thoughts were focused on love rather than fear or anger. Sarah's eulogy, delivered with the assistance of her grandson Robert Jr., summarized the family's 8-decade journey from grief to acceptance to resolution. She spoke about Margaret's unwavering faith that the truth would eventually emerge, about the burden of growing up without knowing whether her father was dead or alive, and about the strange comfort that came from finally understanding the heroic circumstances of Bobby's death. The eulogy emphasized that Bobby's legacy extended far beyond his military service to include the resilience and determination he had inspired in 3 generations of his descendants. The burial service at Grand Island Cemetery placed Bobby's remains in a plot next to Margaret's grave, finally reuniting the couple who had been separated by war for more than 80 years. Military honors included a 21-gun salute, the presentation of a folded American flag to Sarah, and the playing of taps by a bugler from the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. The headstone, inscribed with Bobby's name, dates of service, and the simple phrase "Hero found family whole" marked the end of one of Nebraska's longest-running missing person cases. The establishment of the Robert and Margaret Matthews Foundation, announced during the funeral reception, ensured that Bobby's legacy would continue to benefit future generations. The foundation, funded by donations from around the world and managed by Bobby's great-grandchildren, provides support for families of missing servicemen and funds research into unsolved cases from various military conflicts. The Foundation's mission statement emphasizes that every missing soldier deserves to be remembered and that no family should have to endure 80 years of uncertainty about a loved one's fate. Rousseau's attendance at Bobby's funeral represented the international dimension of the story and highlighted how modern archaeological techniques and international cooperation had made the discovery possible. His presentation during the reception explained the scientific methods used to locate and excavate the bunker, the careful preservation of Bobby's remains and personal effects, and the broader implications of the discovery for understanding World War II battlefield archaeology. The presentation served both educational and commemorative purposes, ensuring that Bobby's story would inspire continued research into other missing servicemen. The media coverage of Bobby's discovery and funeral brought renewed attention to the broader issue of missing World War II personnel and the ongoing efforts to locate and identify their remains. Television documentaries, newspaper articles, and online features about the Matthews family story generated increased public support for organizations like the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency and encouraged other families with missing loved ones to continue their own searches. Bobby's case became a symbol of hope that even the oldest mysteries might eventually be solved through persistence, technology, and international cooperation. Sarah's final act regarding her father's case was the donation of Margaret's extensive research files, photographs and correspondence to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where they would be preserved as part of the museum's collection, documenting the experiences of military families during and after the war. The donation ensured that future researchers and families facing similar circumstances would have access to the detailed records that had been maintained for 80 years, potentially providing guidance and inspiration for other searches. The completion of Bobby's story brought unexpected peace to family members who had grown up with the uncertainty and unresolved grief that had defined 3 generations of their family history. Robert Jr. and Maggie Coleman, now adults with children of their own, reported feeling liberated from the weight of an unsolved mystery that had shaped their family's identity for 8 decades. Their children would grow up knowing their great-great-grandfather as a complete person, a hero who had made the ultimate sacrifice for his country, and a loving husband and father whose final thoughts were of his family back home in Nebraska. The discovery transformed Bobby from a tragic question mark into a source of pride and inspiration, allowing future generations to honor his memory without being burdened by the uncertainty that had haunted their predecessors. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Bobby Matthews. We'll see